Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Spinner. I am a high school English teacher and a USA Today bestselling novelist. And I'm excited to be talking this week to Mike Avery. I was introduced to his book last summer now during the New Mexico Book Awards, and I had the opportunity to read Mama's Boy, which is the third book in his Susan Sorella mystery series. So, Mike, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I spent most of my life as a civil rights lawyer, representing people whose rights were violated by the government and others. And then I spent 16 years as a law professor. And then when I was 70, I went back to school. I went to the Bennington Writers Program and started writing fiction, which I've now been doing for about 10 years.
Oh, that's awesome, and good for you for being willing to try something new. And which it sounds like you've kind of done a couple times now.
Well, yeah, I guess I do like to shake things up a little.
I'm interested to know, and we'll get into this more later, but in trying to tell stories about people who have been in situations like this where their rights are compromised, what is that like as far as the difference between doing that as a lawyer and then telling stories as an author? What are kind of some of the similarities and differences for you with that?
Well, that's interesting. The stories are often similar, but dealing with them as a writer is a lot more fun and a lot less stressful. Whereas representing people in court is highly stressful and very, very difficult and taxing. So this is much better for me now at my age and now that I'm sort of semi-retired and much more enjoyable.
I'm glad you're still getting to share the topics and the stories that are important to you, but in a way that's not quite such an overload for you. I'm glad you're feeling less stressed out as an author than you were probably in your previous jobs.
Well, if I don't do a good job on a story, no one goes to jail.
Very true. Well, before we get too much further in, tell us a little bit about Mama's Boy.
Mama's Boy is a story about a young high school kid in Boston, African American, who is found by the police standing over the dead body of his father with a shotgun in his hand. So, not surprisingly, they arrest him, they charge him with his father's murder, and he starts out way behind the eight ball because the evidence against him is compelling and very difficult. Then he gets his lawyer, Susan Sorella, who's the hero of my series of books about her, and she has to come in and figure out if he didn't do it, who did do it. And that's pretty much what the book is about, as she tracks down various leads and it ends up in a trial, and in a trial we find out the truth.
And you piece everything together, and we'll talk about your development of your mystery in just a minute, but you bring the reader into it and let them follow along with what's happening. And there's kind of different approaches with mystery writing. It can kind of be like telling the reader a little bit more where they're guiding them through what's going on, or you can make the reader feel like they are part of the investigation, figuring out the clues along with the characters. What helped you kind of decide what approach you would take when writing crime and trial-based mysteries?
Well, I do like to have the reader follow Susan Sorella along as she does her investigation. But I also write novels from multiple points of view. So the reader also gets to see what some of the other characters are doing when Susan's not around. And that, I think, accomplishes two things. One, it allows the reader to get a more in-depth view of the other characters and a view that allows them to appreciate some of the moral ambiguity in the story. And then it also heightens suspense because sometimes the reader is aware of what the other characters plan to do before Susan finds out about it. And that creates a little suspense in her chapters.
Well, and that's another interesting part of mystery writers is some will take the approach of the reader only knows as much as the person investigating. The suspense comes from not knowing what's going on and trying to piece it together. But then there is another train of thought that if you have, I'm trying to remember what it was I was reading. And who said it? I have a terrible memory for things like that. But it was something along the lines of it's much more suspenseful if the reader knows there's a bomb under the chair and the character doesn't. And so there's kind of
Uh-huh.
those two frames of mind of how you build suspense in a mystery. And I think either one can be made to work when it's done like with intention and with, really putting the time in to develop it and hone that. So I've seen both sides done really well because I really enjoy mysteries. But I've also seen both sides not done so well. And then you're like, oh, well, you just told me what was happening and now I'm not worried anymore. So how do you avoid some of those pitfalls that can come when writing a mystery of like revealing a little bit too much or not having enough complexity that then the reader is like, well, I already figured it out. Like, why do I need to keep reading? What's your approach for that?
Actually, I write both kinds of mysteries because I write the Susan Sorella mysteries, which have the advantage of using the point of view of various characters. But then I also write the Spencer Dunn mysteries for Relay Publishing, and those are written from the first person point of view, and the reader never learns anything that Spencer doesn't already know. So I think going back and forth between the two types of writing and the two different series allows me to keep in mind what I'm trying to accomplish, which is always to leave the reader in suspense until the very last minute.
I like that. And that's so interesting to go back and forth between the two. I bet that's helped you just learn a lot about creating the suspense just through your own practice and getting better at that over the years. That's really cool.
Well, I hope I hope it works.
Well, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about your characters as well and how you approach character development because in the mystery you've got the person investigating, you've got the person who's, being investigated or who is in the precarious situation of being believed to have done something, and you've got to create this sense of likability and an investment in what's going to happen to the character for readers to really get into it. And you've kind of got that on both sides with her client and with Susan, where you need to care about both of them and the outcome. So what is your approach for just creating those layered characters that people can really get invested in and want to keep reading to know the outcome for their own reader satisfaction?
Well, I think you have to try to put the reader in the character's life. So I try to show Susan Sorella not only as a lawyer, but also as a young woman who has a boyfriend and who works in her father's restaurant and who cares about food and wine and who loves the Boston Red Sox and is an avid fan. And the reader gets to follow her around. The reader goes to, not in Mama's Boy, but in an earlier book, the reader goes to Fenway Park with her one time. The reader's frequently in the kitchen with her. And Susan, how do I want to put this? My overall theme is moral ambiguity. Is there really such a difference between right and wrong? Is there really such a difference between good and evil? Is someone who appears evil capable of good, like Frank Romano, the head of the mob, who's Susan's ally in much of her investigating? And I think as long as I make these characters somewhat balanced, the reader's going to identify with them. I think the readers like Frank Romano, even though he's the head of the mob.
I did feel like as I was reading, you had a knack for having that little bit of likability, even in like the quote unquote worst characters in the book where they're doing a lot of stuff that you're like, oh, this is not a nice person. But you still give him some characteristics that felt relatable and that you could connect with and be like, well, yeah, but sometimes it's just a little tiny but
Well,
there is something there.
In real life, that's how people are. I've represented stone cold killers that I only saw in a prison cell. And to work for them as a lawyer, I had to find some aspect of humanity in the person that I could defend. Not that I would necessarily be able to say what they did was okay, but to try to get the best possible outcome for them, I had to find some kind of human quality. And I did that when I was a practicing lawyer, and that's what I try to do in my writing.
think that's something that is lacking in today's world in a lot of cases of being able to see more than just what's on the surface and making those judgments really quickly. So it's nice when we can see that reflected in art in various forms of, I guess, kind of that reminder of humanity, that nothing is as simple as that black and white, that I'm sure it would make life a little bit easier and more predictable if everything was just black and white, but that's just not the case. And I did like that that really seemed to be a theme in your writing of taking that deeper look and not being so quick, jump to a judgment on anybody, that it's really hard to tell just from the outside perspective what exactly is going on in a situation.
You know, in Mama's Boy, there are two mamas. There's the mama who raised him, and there's his biological mother, which the reader doesn't find out about until later in the book. And that biological mother, I think one is inclined to have a negative view of her because she abandoned her child. On the other hand, I tried to write her in a way that let the reader understand her a little bit. And in fact, I let her play a trick on Susan at one point, and I think the reader is kind of rooting for her at that point. So, like you said, things are complicated, and I enjoy really plumbing those complications.
I think that really adds a lot of depth to any story, just to, I think, really invest in the development of your characters and take that time to imagine who they are outside of the story and what their life has been like. Because even though, yes, they're not real, they live in our head, they do still need to have life beyond the page, or they're not going to be terribly engaging characters because they just kind of come off as flat and one-sided too often if a writer doesn't take the time to really invest and develop in their character, like as a whole person. I think that really makes a difference. And even if readers sometimes don't know why they're not connecting with a character, I feel like often when I've read and I've just been like, this character, like, I don't know, I'm just not getting into them. Like, I end up having a lot of questions that are never answered. Why do they think this way? And what affected them earlier in their life that led to these choices and decisions? And when you can't really answer a lot of that, I think that makes it really hard for a reader to connect.
Yes, most writers, before they start writing the story, they develop an idea of who the characters are going to be and give them backstories and give them histories, and you actually write that down. And it may not all appear in the book. Much of it won't appear in the book, but it informs, I think, the writer's idea of who he or she is writing about. And that gets across to the reader, whether in literal terms or maybe it's just a feeling, but somehow you communicate that.
I think that happens in such small ways, page after page after page, and sometimes intentional, and sometimes I think we don't even realize we're doing it because we know the character so well. We're just working it into the story. But yeah, I think that really stands out to the reader when they can pick up those little bits and pieces. And I would say with your setting as well, it's set in Boston. You're a New Mexico resident now, but you do have some familiarity with the Boston area, right?
Oh, I lived there for 35 years. I spent most of my life in Boston, or the biggest part of my life in Boston in any event.
So
So I like Boston. Boston is a very interesting place. And the north end of Boston, the Italian neighborhood, very European neighborhood, old-fashioned neighborhood, that's where my stories mostly take place. And that's very interesting. When I was a practicing lawyer, I had a client from the north end. And I learned a lot from him that I try to put across in my stories.
not everybody writes with places that they have lived and have a deep familiarity with. And sometimes, whether that's financial or access, not everybody can write from that firsthand knowledge. So I was curious if you have read other books and what you would say are some of the key things that stick out to you that help the reader feel like the setting is real, because you can kind of compare to someone who knows it versus someone who maybe you get the impression they don't know it that well, and the difference that can make in the realism of a story.
Yes, I think that's true. Well, let's put it this way. I lived in New Orleans for 5 years, and I wouldn't try to write a novel that takes place in New Orleans because even though I got to know New Orleans while living there, it's such a fascinating, strange place that I wouldn't purport to to be an expert enough on New Orleans to write about it. Maybe that's being a little shy on my part. I think if place is going to be important to your story, you really have to understand that place and you have to be able to drop some things in the story so that the reader knows that you know what you're talking about.
I think that's great advice. I can't remember. It was an author who wrote like kind of beachy type mystery, and it was set in a place where she visited on a yearly basis. And so she had become familiar with this area over time to where she felt confident enough to use it as the setting for her book. And she had given some advice that if you have only been somewhere as a tourist, you should limit yourself to using that setting as a character visiting that location versus like the character lives there. And I thought that was
Uh-huh.
interesting advice because, I mean, not everybody can do that, right? And not everybody can be like, well, I'd love to set my book in, the prairies of Oklahoma. I'm going to go live there for 7 years, and then I'm going to write the book about it. That just doesn't work for everyone. But
No, but it
we can
doesn't always
try.
have to be. It doesn't always have to be that extreme. For example, in my second book, Murder in Blue, second book in the Susan Sorella series, she goes down to the Tampa Bay area to conduct an investigation. Now, I used to have a condo on Treasure Island in the Tampa Bay area, and I was there a lot. I didn't live there all year round, but I was there enough so that I felt I could convey that setting to the reader in a realistic way. It's only a part of the book, it's not the whole book, but I think you can become it depends how you use it, which I guess is what you just said. I was using it as a part of an investigation, and I knew the Tampa Bay area well enough to do that.
I like that focus where thinking about setting as where the story is, or I guess almost sometimes setting becomes a character of its own because it's so integral to the characters and what's going on in the story. And that can be a really fun way to incorporate setting, but not every book is that, I guess, enmeshed with where it's taking place. And so that might be a little bit of a difference in that, I would say, maybe.
Yes, writers who Raymond Chandler, if you put your book in Los Angeles and you write the way he did, you better know Los Angeles pretty well. But you could put a book someplace where the setting isn't that important. It's more about the characters or, more about something that happens in the story.
I agree. Well, and I think yours had a good balance between characters and setting. I often felt like as I was reading that I could visualize the settings, which was really helpful. But I also was very focused on the characters as well. So I had a good amount of both on either side. And I felt like they were woven together well in the story. Was that something that, like, you focused on intentionally, or did that just develop organically as you were writing of bringing character and setting together?
I would say it probably developed organically because when I started the first Susan Sorella book, I was basing it in part on a case I had actually tried. In fact, the last case I tried before I stopped trying cases. And so what I was doing there was taking a real story, changing it so that it was different from what happened in the real world, but still had the story was about bad FBI agents framing innocent people, and I knew the real bad agents who had framed innocent people, and I had questioned them under oath. So I had sort of a lot going for me in that book in terms of making the characters appear real. But the other characters I made up. And so that book was kind of a combination of something that was made up and something that really happened.
Well, it's interesting. I imagine you have lots to pull from your career to integrate into your stories. And sometimes I think writers of all genres kind of get that question of like, oh, is this something you've lived through or whatever? And sometimes it can be a bit challenging to see where we're actually drawing from real life, if it's like snippets of people that we know. And in your case, a lot more direct of you've done what your character is doing in the series. How do you approach like what you draw from, what you can share, what you need to change to keep yourself from having any issues with anyone coming to you and being like, "Hey, why are you talking about me in your book?" What
Well,
advice would you give?
in the first place, I'm a man and I have a female protagonist. And I'm 81 years old and I have a 30 something protagonist. So I don't have too much trouble getting myself mixed up with her. The area where I am the most interested in fidelity to real life are the courtroom scenes because a lot of mysteries and a lot of books that deal with the law and most of what you see on television isn't very true to life. But Scott Turow, who wrote Presumed Innocent, nails it in all his books. Everything in those books is exactly like it would actually happen in a courtroom or in the prosecutor's office or in the defense counsel's office. And that's where I'm really trying to use my experience in all those places to make it as real as possible. If the judge makes a ruling on evidence in one of my books, it's what a judge should actually do. Not to say judges are always right in real life, but this is what the judge should do and usually does do. So that the courtroom scenes are where I try the hardest to bring my experience to bear to make it really true to life.
Well, and that kind of leads me to asking about your process for developing your mystery overall. Because it sounds like you do draw some inspiration from cases you've actually been involved with or are aware of, but you're going to change it up and make it your own to make it fit your characters and your situation. So, what is your process for developing the mystery arc? Are you a planner? Do you line it all out beforehand? Do you have major points and then kind of just dive in and fill in the gaps? What do you do?
I do both because the books I write for Relay, the Spencer Dunn series, they have a team that has developed an outline for the book. And I write off that outline. Frequently I change things and do something different. But when I write those books, I'm writing from an outline. When I write the Susan Sorella book, Stephen King says, put your protagonist in trouble and see how he gets out of it. And so that's sort of my approach to the Susan Sorella books. I just start writing, and the characters, there's a logic to what they do. And the logic of chapter 4 leads to chapter 5, and that leads to chapter 6. And then I get to the middle of the book, and I realize I need to think a little bit now about where this is going. I've been on automatic pilot up until now, letting the characters decide where we were going. But now I really need to figure out who done it and how I'm going to show that and, what's going to happen at the trial because the books end with a trial. So in the Susan Sorella books, I'm kind of letting the story find its own way up to a certain point and then figuring out the end.
I like that that gives you some flexibility to kind of make adjustments and changes if you get to a point where you're like, well, I thought she would do this or things would go this way, but actually it would mesh better with what you've already got to do something a little bit different. I think where I struggle with like outlining is sometimes then I feel boxed in to the situation, and that can make me kind of struggle against that box as far as trying to access my creativity. So I like that of having the general idea, but then still giving yourself room to play with it as you go.
And you might even change it at the very end. Now, I don't want to spoil things for people who haven't read Mama's Boy yet, but I bet when you read Mama's Boy, you had one idea of how it was going to go, And then maybe you changed your mind, and you might even have changed your mind again.
You did do a nice job of throwing in some red herrings and some curves to keep the reader guessing, so I appreciated that. Well, and Mike, we are starting to get close to time to wrap up, but wanted to give you a chance. We've got Mama's Boy that is out and available for people. Do you have something else on the horizon as well that people can then look at after they check out Mama's Boy?
I have the fourth book in the series, which I'm working on right now. I'm about halfway through it. I intend to finish my manuscript in February, and then it'll go to an editor. And that's another murder mystery. Susan Sorella's the defense lawyer. And here's the interesting thing, which I'll tempt readers with. The defendant is Frank Romano's nephew, also a member of the mob. So this time we're going to get a little bit more into gangland.
Well, that'll be interesting because that's going to bring up some really interesting questions for Susan that she's going to have to, I would guess, ask herself and battle with a bit as she's kind of becoming a little bit more enmeshed in what's going on there.
You're absolutely right.
Interesting. All right. We'll keep an eye out for that. And as we start to finish up, where can people find you online and find all of your books if they would like to go check things out?
Well, everything is on Amazon. And if you put in Mike Avery, you'll find all my fiction. And if you put in Michael Avery, you'll find my nonfiction books, which are about law and politics.
Awesome. And that's a great way to keep things separated out. I was listening to a discussion about how to keep your different genres straight, so I like that. So Mike Avery for the fiction, Michael Avery for the nonfiction. And I will put a link to your website in the show notes for anyone who's interested.
Oh,
Would you
thank you.
let people know what that website is? And then do you do any social media that people might want to connect with you on?
I'm on mostly Facebook is what I post on, and my website, michaelavery.work. There I have a newsletter. So if your listeners go to michaelavery.work, they can sign up for my newsletter, and approximately every month they'll get a newsletter from me talking about what books I like to read, and there's usually also a recipe for some good food.
Oh, I always love a good recipe. All right. Well, I want to remind our listeners before we sign off that the book is called Mama's Boy by Mike Avery, and this is the third book in the Susan Sorello mystery. And I will say it's easy to jump in, but I didn't have the opportunity to read the first two books quite yet. But if this one is the one that intrigues people, I didn't have any trouble just jumping into the series. So you never know.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to your listeners.